Started.
Great.
Okay, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. I'm sorry about the small hiatus in our virtual EP lecture series, but now we're getting started again, and I'm very excited about today's session. So, just a couple of brief housekeeping points. If anyone has any ideas of people or topics that they would like to have covered, please just send them to me and to Abhishek, and we'll try to get them in the schedule. Second, we will, for some of the previous lectures as well as this one, we will be putting it online. We were supposed to do it before, but whatever, we didn't yet. But we will, and we'll let everyone know the link at which to access these. So today's lecture is going to be on pulse field ablation, and will be by Dr. Steve Mickelsen. So when you think about pulse field ablation in electrophysiology, to me, there are really two important forces that are really sort of brought this to the fore. The first, I would argue, is Fred Whitcamp's lab, who sort of kept this concept alive through most of the past decade, publishing every couple of years something very interesting that most of us sort of really didn't follow, to be honest. I certainly didn't. And then the second force, I would argue, is Steve. Steve Mickelsen really has brought this to the fore, I would argue, clinically. And with his efforts at initially at FARAPULSE and beyond, I think he's really brought this or pushed this to the clinical arena in a way that nobody else really has. So Steve is an electrophysiologist and has an engineering background. He was a Howard Hughes Research Scholar at NIH. He completed his medical school at the University of New Mexico, and he completed internal medicine at Mayo Clinic. His cardiology fellowship at the University of Iowa, and he's continued to practice electrophysiology at the University of Iowa, and he holds an associate professorship there. As it turns out, after initially founding FARAPULSE, he also has been involved in several other industry electrophysiology ventures, let's say, including working at Acutus Medical. But most recently, about a year ago, or I guess less than that, he founded a new company called Field Medical, which is also working on a new pulse field ablation catheter. And that, I suppose, is his primary full-time job. He's the founder and CEO. But in addition, he continues to practice electrophysiology, currently at Scripps in Loyola, California. And I asked Steve to talk to us, not so much about the companies that he's working on now, but rather about the fundamentals of electrophysiology. I think there are a few people who understand this as well as Steve, and I think this will be a very interesting discussion. So Steve, please, love to hear your talk.
Well, thank you very much, Vivek. It's great. It's quite an honor to be able to talk to your entire group here. I'll get started. Pulse field ablation is really close to my heart. I thought I was going to be a cardiac autonomics guy, but when I was trying to find a new way to treat atrial fibrillation back in the early 2000s, 2010, AFib ablation was a 4-hour procedure on average, and even though AFib in general was a nuisance problem, there was probably an unacceptably high number of complications that was frustrating to me, especially since I'd been following the development of this procedure since the conception in the 1990s. When I was looking at ways of improving our approach, I looked at all the ways that you can ablate tissue, including alcohol, radiation, diphtheria toxin, ultrasound, etc. And of course, I came across some of Whitcamp's stuff and all the early ablation technology from the 1980s. And I'll share a little bit of that history with everyone here today when we talk about pulse field. So over the last 37 years, we've been using radio frequency ablation is the primary method for ablating soft tissue in the heart. And radio frequency ablation is incredibly effective and safe. But despite years and years of improvement, iteratively putting in things like thermistors to watch the temperature in the tip, ways of irrigating the tip, better localization with electromagnetic navigation, and shaft design, etc. We still have technical challenges for radio frequency, which includes controlling heat transfer in ways that prevent things like this, which is a steam pop, or the ability to make reliable, precise lesions in the ventricle. The ventricle is very difficult because it's moving so much, and just navigation in that space can be problematic for something that requires 30 seconds of contact in order to effectively create large lesions. Electroporation comes by many names: fulguration, electroporation, DC ablation, irreversible electroporation, pulse electric field, etc. But fundamentally what everyone really thinks about is that it's non-thermal. Radiofrequency ablation, if you really look at the joule energy that's used per lesion, if you're a guy who likes high output, short duration RF, you're talking 500 joules, because 50 watts times 10 seconds. Whereas with pulse electric field, it's possible to make an even larger lesion in cardiac tissue with only 15 joules. That doesn't mean that it's non-thermal. It really means that it is minimally thermal, and the main mechanism of tissue injury is not coagulant necrosis from overheating the tissue, but a metabolic injury. Electroporation works by putting electrostatic stress on the membranes of the cell, and the membranes of the cell that are, their whole purpose is to sequester or exclude the outer environment from the inner biochemistry of the cell, to facilitate biochemical reactions that would normally take eons to occur by random. With this electrostatic strain, we open the membrane, we make it permeable. Now, whether it is kind of somewhat questionable about that mechanism, but in order to create, anytime you put energy into a system, you create heat. And I like to talk about heat a little bit in this context of this talk, just because when you look at some of the technical challenges facing pulse field, I don't think we can discount heat too much. And the reason is because of a phenomenon called heat stacking. When we put energy into a system, first, law of thermodynamics, we could eventually create enough heat that it is of clinical relevance. With electroporation, when we put this electrostatic strain on the membrane, there are several theories for why the membrane opens. Early on, Newman and a number of other research scientists in the 1970s kind of coined the term of electroporation, because they believed that in order for large molecules to get across the membrane, there must be pretty big doors opened in the membrane. And this is something they were observing. The whole technique of electroporation was really developed as a microbiology technique to transfect large molecules into cells that are going to be cultured. And but further research has suggested there are other mechanisms by which you can make the cell membrane permeable, some of which are peroxidation of the actual lipid membrane components, the bilipid polarized molecules in the membrane itself. Small holes can be opened up as well, and even the transmembrane proteins and ion channels and things like this can be perturbed and moved, because there's a lot of charged molecules that are included in those proteins. In the 1980s and 90s, there's one really interesting paper by Chang where they flash froze some red blood cells, looked at the membrane with scanning electron microscopy, and then they also had some red cells that they electroporated and immediately flash froze them, looked at those membranes, they also let some of those cells recover over a period of 10 minutes and then flash froze them and looked at them. And what they saw is this kind of series of events where, the membrane appearance returns to normal after a certain period of time, but immediately after being exposed to this strong electric field, there's these kind of these pits that were observed in the cell membrane. Now, more recently, this is controversial. We don't think that these are actually holes at this level. Matter of fact, the size of these pits was a little bit big. What this probably represents is edema and some changes in the membrane components that hold the cell, mostly anchorin protein, things like that. But needless to say, there's clearly a membrane effect. The electric field itself, when we think about electroporation, a lot of people talk about volts. They talk about different waveforms, monophasic, biphasic, unipolar, bipolar, et cetera, and things. But fundamentally, what's important to the cell is how strong is the electric field that the cell membrane is exposed to, how much static force is there. And this is a unit we call the electric field strength. Volts over meters squared is really what it's called. In the background here, you see this this reddish color. This is an experiment I did for a couple of years in my lab at the University of Iowa, where I just fire off pulses into little petri dishes full of jello and hamster cells with this chemical called propydium iodine. When it gets into the cell, it fluoresces this reddish color. And so if you electroporate the cell, the molecules get into the cell and you can see them, and all the cells are held in the same position in the jello. So you can see very clearly what the electric field lines look like for electroporated cells. And geometry is the other factor. So you have volts over meters squared. So when we're trying to compare different types of electroporation between different tools, it becomes hard to extrapolate information, not only because the waveforms can be wildly different, but just the geometry alone can have a massive effect and the orientation of the electrodes in respect to the tissue on what how deep a lesion could possibly be. Here you can see a 3-to-1 difference if you had tissue on one side of your cathode versus in between the cathode and the anode. Electroporation also works very much like pacing. It's got a strength duration curve, and the same effect can be achieved with lower peak voltages as long as you maintain that voltage for longer periods of time. At some point, you don't even meet the threshold, and you're on that asymptote and for electroporating, and so no matter how long you keep the energy on, you will never electroporate. And vice versa, you can get to infinity on the other side. There's some cool papers out there that on the basic biophysics. Here's this molecular dynamic modeling of the membrane being exposed to a 1 nanosecond pulse. What I also like to point out to people who are interested in this topic is that, a 1 nanosecond pulse leads to about a 30 nanosecond opening in the membrane. So the reclosing time, these time constant can be used to some advantage. And this is one of the reasons why you'll notice that a lot of the electroporation pulses aren't just a single pulse, they're pulse trains. And because there's no sense in keeping energy on while the membrane's open. And so a lot of the pulse trains will allow a certain amount of time for the membrane to reclose before you hit it again. Another issue with electroporation is, and people, when they think about electricity moving in the body, they really think that it's electrons jumping from the anode all the way to the cathode. But the reality is that in ionic solution, that the electric energy is transferred through electrochemistry and electrochemical gradients. It's we don't have the same metallic conduction doesn't really exist in the body like it's most people model it that way, but that's not how it works. The consequences mean that, every time we put electricity in the body, we get an electrochemical reaction, or electrolysis is common. And so with electroporation, we will see hydrogen oxygen bubbles being created, as well as large gradients of positive or negatively charged ions move towards the anode and cathode. And that is all joule dependent as well. In the end, all these kind of physics factors lead to stress on the cell and ultimately a metabolic injury to the cell, leaving the cell architecture largely intact, but leaving the cell without energy or promoting the release of pro-apoptotic factors in the cell, leading to an apoptotic death. And those are the two main mechanisms by which the tissue actually dies. With coagulative necrosis, where you keep tissue above 50 degrees centigrade for a few seconds or longer, almost every type of cell in the body will perish. And you will denature proteins and denature extracellular proteins, and you'll lose a lot of that architecture. And so, but with electroporation, all that's maintained. And so in order for when you right after electroporation, you'll look at the cells and they'll look like they're probably still alive, but you let them go a couple of hours, or a couple of days, and clearly all that tissue is gone. Your macrophages are coming in, pulling everything away and replacing it with fibroblasts. All out in the world, a lot of people like to talk about apoptosis as a mechanism of cell injury or cell death in electroporation, but the reality is it's actually pretty rare. Most of the cells that I see in cardiac tissue with most of the waveforms that we use in the contemporary electroporation, you'll generally see necrosis 500 times, and you'll see apoptosis 1 time. This is some work that I did back in the 10 years ago, almost. This is just a couple of hours after doing electroporation on this is a dog heart, actually. But you see extravasation of red blood cells into the interstitial space. These are blood vessels that have some blood in them, some edema, but the myocytes don't particularly look dead. I couldn't get a pathologist to tell me definitively that my electroporation had done anything besides cause some edema. When we looked at it with transmission electron microscopy, however, this was a section of muscle that was remote from the actual ablation lesion itself. And this is what it looks like. You get the mitochondria, you get these little globules full of glycogen. You can see the M and Z lines of the actin and myosin fibers. And that's what healthy cardiac myocytes look like under an electron microscope. If you take the zone that you ablated, even though it looks edematous and looks like maybe it's still alive, the mitochondria are really edematous, and they've lost a lot of the cristae and the features of that you're used to looking at in the mitochondria. And importantly, though, that all the glycogen stores are gone. You can't find them anywhere, and so clearly these cells are not going to survive. If you look at a normal piece of heart tissue with a Mason trichrome stain, all the collagen is this blue color, or things that have a lot of fiber, and then the red stuff is cardiac myocytes. 2 weeks later, this is what it looks like. A lot of people have talked about the preservation of the other structures that are associated with cardiac tissue. For instance, over here we see an arteriole that has its smooth muscle endothelium. We see the nerve fibers all preserved, the endocardium and the fat cells, everything. These cells never were killed by the field, and it's not that the electroporation can't kill those cells or damage those structures. It's just that the threshold for cardiac myocytes is they're exquisitely sensitive to electric field mediated tissue injury, and so this gives us a range selectivity that we don't have with every organ, but in this particular organ, it works out favorably. Why is it cardiac selective and not and doesn't kill all cells kind of at the same threshold and the same exposure? Has a lot to do with the energy requirements of tissue. Contractility in the heart, it uses up about 60% or more of the ATP of the cell over the lifetime. The heart can't ever take a break, it always has to work. And so a lot of ATP, the basal metabolic rate of cardiac myocytes is quite high. Another one is another place where a lot of ATP is expended in cardiac myocytes is actually the maintaining a negative inward potential in the membrane. This can be 30 or 40% of the entire energy requirements of the cell. Interestingly enough, if you electroporate a cell, if you remove the ability of the cell to maintain that, if you electroporate a cell, you effectively depolarize the cell. And there are some highly expressed proteins in cardiac myocytes. This sodium potassium ATPase is highly expressed in this, in some kidney tissue, etc. But it is active when the cell membrane is depolarized. So instead of being active only during the refractory period, now it's going to be active for minutes at a time. And this just sits around and eats up all the ATP along with the calcium ATPase that's trying to sequester all the calcium that's been released into the cytosol. So if you look at the sensitivity of different cells, adipose cells, even though they're large, are very hard to irreversibly electroporate, but very easy to open the membrane. So transiently the membrane opens, but it has a lot of time to reseal. Smooth muscle, it's is about 1 order of magnitude less sensitive than cardiac myocytes. So again, you can electroporate it, but it is possible to ablate it, but it's a lot less sensitive than cardiac myocytes. Whereas cardiac myocytes, which have a high metabolic basal rate, are incredibly sensitive. Another very sensitive cell in the body is gray matter in the brain. Even though axons themselves are very hard to ablate, the energy centers of those cells are very easy to ablate. Fulguration is this, electroporation is not new. And so a lot of very smart people were looking at it at the same time I was. This was Wittkamp, Karsnev, and Sam Ashravatham was looking at it at the Mayo, and a number of other people were curious about it. But it really started in the late 1800s, where people were experimenting with every form of electricity out there and putting it in the body and to treat every ailment. In fact, electrical therapies became associated with quackery, because a lot of it was absolutely quackery. But there was some really interesting real therapies, and one of them was fulguration. So they would take a transformer and really amplify the voltage and sit there and just shoot sparks into you, and give you a stick to chew on while they did it. And here's a photograph from World War I, where a nurse is actually treating either a mole or a wart or possibly basal cell carcinoma. There's actually a lot of papers out there, maybe 10 papers is a lot in those days, or people describe using fulguration to treat basal cell carcinoma in particular. It was somewhat effective. Over the years, all that's in 1920s was like the last time I found any papers on it after extensive searches. And it wasn't until 1976 till somebody else really tried to use high voltage pulses to ablate tissue of any sort. And this guy is he's the real origin of interventional electrophysiology, in my mind. So in the 1970s, this guy, James Bazal, was frustrated because he was working with a dog model looking at a pacemaker mediated cardiomyopathy, and they needed to do AV node ablation in order to control the cardiac rate and for chronic pacing. But this was a very difficult animal model where half the animals would die because it was an open chest AV node ablation, and they tried injecting alcohol into the AV node sometimes with Brockenbrow needles, but again, a very high mortality rate in the animal model. He was frustrated, so he just took a Brockenbrow needle, put it with a plastic sheath on it, put it up against the AV node, and attached the other side to a defibrillator, and fired it off. And sure enough, he got heart block, and all the animals survived. He published an abstract on it, and this was observed by Mel Scheinman, and probably Gallagher as well. But Mel Scheinman took to doing a series of animals and was doing research through the 70s, partnered partially with Bazell and a guy named Levy out of Mount Sinai. He was doing rounds on at UCSF in 1980, and he had a patient who was dying of heart failure. The surgeon from AFib with RVR, and the surgeons didn't want to take the patient to the OR because he was too sick. Mel Scheinman offered him this experimental technique, applied it, and sure enough, after a defibrillator shock to the heart, boom, he had heart block, and they had a pacemaker, and he was discharged from the hospital successfully. He collected a series of patients, and across on the East Coast, Gallagher at Duke also did the same, and they published both papers within a month of each other. Mel Scheinman always told me he thought he was scooped by Gallagher, and who knows what the real truth was. We don't know. We just don't know. Here's some cool footage I dug up from a colleague of mine, Michael Giudici, who was practicing in the 1980s. He did some cine photography of a DC ablation of a patient. He's got a quadrupolar catheter sitting at the AV node. He's already installed the pacemaker, and he's going to zap it. In the middle frame, he captures this kind of radiolucency, this dark area around the catheter that's about a centimeter kind of zone, and then the catheter bumps. And what that is a phenomenon called flash arcing. So when you put a strong electric field into solution, an ionic solution, you get electrochemical reaction, you get electrolysis, you get hydrogen, you get oxygen, depending on what polarity you're using. And the resistance for the electrons to move into the solution. Yeah, say again? Oh, okay. Into solution becomes much higher than it does to go into the elemental gas. And when the electrons start going into an elemental gas, you get a change of phase into plasma. And this changes volume and pushes the water away. Meanwhile, all electrons are kind of going out to the outside. So this is some high-speed footage of that phenomenon. And in the 1980s, this was sort of a question as catheter ablation was emerging. People were very worried about this barotrauma. It seemed like a very uncontrolled way to perform this procedure. And so a lot of smart people were trying to figure out, how do we get DC ablation to be safer, better? And the smart guy, Boyd and Cunningham at the London Heart Hospital with this guy, Rowland, figured out that if they shorten the pulses, they could really reduce the risk of any type of flash arcing. And this is the first electroporation machine. This is 10 microsecond, 5,000 volt pulses, multiple channels, synchronized, ready to go, and commercially available in 1986. A lot of people were looking at DC ablation in the late 80s, including Gus Barty. He's the guy who invented the sub-Q ICD, still is practicing at the University of Washington in Seattle. But this is a really great paper he published in 1990, where he actually he wanted to figure out what's more important, the peak voltage or total energy. And he kept the energy at 15 joules for an application of DC ablation, epicardially on this animal model. And in one case, he fires a whole bunch of smaller pulses at lower voltage to equal 15 joules, or in a couple of pulses at 5,000 volts and to equal 15 joules, and looked at the results over the course of months, and found that having a higher peak voltage was more important. In other words, the V over M squared is, the electric field strength is a more important determinant of the ablation than total energy is. And so very interesting that with 15 joules, you can make such a large lesion. This is about 8 millimeters deep. All right, so fast forward to 2010, and all of a sudden we start doing this again in humans. There's some great data that came out with Vivek's group and others looking at a clinical application to treat AFib, showing very encouraging results, and an arms race in the field of electrophysiology began. And we're starting to learn more and more about this technology. It's a very new, even though it's a reinvention of an old technique, there is a lot to learn here. So this first generation of technology is a large step forward. The promise of electroporation is that we can effectively perform soft tissue ablation in the heart with some level of selectivity that is favorable to protect structures like the phrenic nerve and the esophagus, et cetera, and increase the procedural efficiency at the same time. Some interesting data that's coming out that I find quite exciting to look at is things like this. Where are the gaps from a technology that has a 90% durable pulmonary vein isolation capability? And the pattern of gaps is similar in pulse field as it is with a number of other technologies, and it's on the right pulmonary veins, which are actually not the deepest, thickest parts of the left atria, and which suggests to me that despite all these years of improving our energy delivery, it's really the delivery systems that fail us on the right side. That's a whole nother topic, but this first generation of pulse field is really focused heavily on having cork in the bottle type tools that do one thing, which is pulmonary vein isolation, maybe a couple of other things too. Large, huge swaths of tissue can be taken out with a few seconds of application. The data does support some of these early claims, which is that some of the early problems of AFib ablation is pulmonary vein stenosis. This is why we do the WACA lesion. Proponi, after Hasseguer and Piaget said, "Hey, guess what? We can actually treat AFib with a catheter ablation, but it takes 2 days of mapping and ablating to get it done." Poponi said, "Hey, why don't we just ablate all the veins? I don't want to map it for 2 days." And that was a much better procedure. Then we learned, oh gosh, we got pulmonary vein stenosis. So then Nasir Marouche came up with the cool idea of trying to do an ablation set outside the veins a little bit, the wide antral circumferential ablation of the pulmonary veins. But with pulse field, this appears not to be as big of an issue. Maybe it will be. We will learn later. But the data is starting to accumulate that pulmonary vein stenosis with pulse field seems to be a remote possibility. Esophageal injury is something that we all worry about. The numbers, it's a devastating complication from AFib ablation. But here's some great animal data from Kruth's group, and showing that you can easily reproducibly make a horrific lesion in the esophagus by ablating inside the heart in an animal model. But if you apply the same therapeutic level of electroporation in the same spot in another animal, you will not get a fistula. And this is very reassuring and follows the predicted data that was out there ahead of time. It's not that you can't ablate the esophagus, though, and this is important to remember, because here's some data where direct application of pulse field to the esophagus was capable, if you turn it up high enough, to ablate transmurally in the esophagus. Now, does this have the same sequelae or implications as a thermal injury? This is not known at this point. There's some interesting, because all these animal models are healthy animals otherwise, and so if you take somebody with a sick esophagus, will electroporation have a fistula someday? I think it's possible, and so but we've moved the risk profile, in the right direction by changing the energy. There's some great data that was published, I think, about 2 years ago, looking at MRI changes in the esophagus after thermal ablation versus electroporation. And one, you see delayed hyperenhancement of the esophagus almost universally with any type of thermal ablation for AFib, whereas with pulse field, it didn't seem to reach into the esophagus in a meaningful way, and that was also encouraging. Phrenic nerve palsy is something that we worry about with thermal ablation, yet with a pulse field, even direct application onto the phrenic nerve very rarely results in any serious injury to the tissue. But it is not impossible to have transient phrenic nerve conduction delay and or palsy. And this is largely due to the axons themselves. If you electroporate them, i.e. you depolarize that section, you cannot propagate an action potential over it, number one. So if you had a high enough electric field there, then you would do that. The other is that the perineurium itself is involved in conduction velocity. And so if you interfere with the myosin and other perineurial cells or cause edema, all those things can result in slowed conduction, but generally very recoverable. Arrhythmia is something people aren't paying a lot of attention to with electroporation. Anytime you fire a pulse of high voltage into the T wave, everyone in this room is aware that we can induce VF pretty reproducibly. But in the atria is not as big of a problem, and depending on your waveform and your approach, this is less of an issue. I think as we move into the ventricle, it'll be much more important for electroporation to pay attention to synchrony, just because anytime you electroporate, you depolarize, and if you depolarize once, you can propagate one action potential, potentially causing an arrhythmia. No matter if you're using high frequency biphasics or monophasic pulses. Vasospasm is really a far field effect of the of pulse field ablation. This is another issue that's emerging or becoming more talked about. This was described in the 1980s with DC ablation, but it is a bigger issue now because we have such a high volume of patients and people want to use electroporation outside of pulmonary vein isolation. And with this, as we get close to the annulus and we get into near these great vessels, there will need to be some management strategies here. The mechanism is not fully understood, but there are some great hypothetical reasons why you would get this, either direct stimulation of the afferent fibers to the smooth muscle in the tissue, i.e. you're just stimulating the nerves that cause the vasospasm directly, or indirectly through transient release of calcium inside the cell by partially electroporating or reversibly electroporating the smooth muscle. And even the release of vasoactive compounds into the blood in a localized manner, less likely based on the pattern of spasm that we see, but possible. And there's a really nice recent paper, and I think you know who wrote it, but the showing, intentional, angiography during electroporation along the annulus. Stiff atria is another area where we think that there's some real advantages to electroporation as our pulse field ablation, just because when you preserve the collagen, you don't denature these proteins, the mechanism of tissue healing allows for the passive mechanical structure of the tissue to remain. And you don't need to put in new collagen and have the contraction phase of scar formation. You preserve that passive function of the tissue. And we've seen with MRI based methods that the passive capacitive function of the atria remains after PFA, but with thermal ablation seems to be somewhat compromised. We haven't done a lot of work on interference with devices. In fact, every clinical trial that is out there, except for one that I know of, excludes patients with devices in situ. So, very likely there will not be a big issue where you accidentally you cause enough interference to cause a defibrillator to accidentally or misfire or cause permanent damage to the device itself. Most of the safety circuits in these devices are capable of filtering pulse field. No, we don't know that for a fact, and there's one paper only out there looking at it in any detail. But one of the theoretical challenges we could face is that when you are ablating near an electrode itself, you'll get some eddy currents and areas of high current density near the electrode, causing ablation of that tissue. And so you could see an increase in your pacing thresholds in some patients, and so some caution we should proceed with caution in these circumstances. Durability of the lesion, people have been talking about, is it as durable as an RF lesion? And pre and post remapping studies show that the acute and the chronic patterns of 3D electroanatomic mapping look like they are consistent. There is a transition zone early on in if you electroporate cardiac myocytes, there's a zone that does recover. This penumbra of tissue is mostly due to gap junctions being shut down. And so the cells are alive and well, they're just not propagating action potentials. This is a safety mechanism that's very similar to what happens in ischemic tissue. This penumbra or infarct zone occurs with a increase in pH or a decrease in pH or a release of calcium into the cellular cytosol that shuts down gap junctions. Gap junctions are very sensitive to cytosolic calcium. All right, but those are some of the issues that remain. As you guys watch this technology evolve over the next several years, you'll see people moving away from doing just pulmonary vein isolation alone, and hopefully someday replace most applications that we currently perform with radio frequency with pulse electric field technology. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. So we have about 15 minutes for questions. And so if people want to go ahead and ask questions, just let me know. Otherwise, I have a bunch of questions that I can certainly fill up the time. Alternatively, if you want to send questions in by the chat, please do. So just to get started, Steve, as I was listening to your talk, I want to just talk a little bit about movement. You talked about that a little bit in the beginning with the RF ablation. Let's say you're doing a 20-second and 30-second lesion. Obviously, movement makes a difference. Actually, it hasn't been studied as well as it probably should be. But one of the things that we're sort of learning with things like the Q-dot catheter is that in some ways, movement makes an even bigger impact, right? Because when you have a short lesion, 4 seconds, and let's say you move for a short amount of time, well, that could be 50% of the time of energy delivery. So I'm just wondering how you think about movement with pulse field. Do we have any data or any sort of understanding of what if the catheter is sort of sliding back and forth on tissue, right? And you're
Yeah.
delivering, let's say it's a 4 or 5 second lesion. What do you think can happen? What do we know?
Well, I have some experience with an observational experience I can share. So when you're with pulse field, the time domain that we're working on is delivering a lesion in milliseconds. If you're synchronized with diastole, then the ventricle in a series of 100 or 200 milliseconds is essentially static. If you're doing it over multiple cardiac cycles, then of course it's not static, and that can be problematic. There are several ways that the catheter can either be the heart muscle can be skipping over the catheter,
Mm,
or the catheter can be bouncing
mhm,
because there's a fulcrum effect somewhere.
mm,
And both of these stability issues can lead to challenges in predicting the lesion shape, size, area that is being delivered at. With pulse field, of course, that it's that time domain that's going to dictate whether or not that's an issue. If you can deliver it all in that 200 microsecond period or millisecond period, then it's less of an issue. But catheter stability for RF is mission critical, and the Q dot is a great example. So you point out that sometimes they can make a smaller lesion. If it's not in contact all the time, it's bouncing, or even transient bouncing can be a problem. But the other issue is that if you're sliding but in contact the whole time, now you've distributed the energy over a larger area, and so maybe it's not as deep, but it's wide.
yeah.
Um,
Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, so uh, just because pulse field works very well with a slow-mo camera, you can avoid a lot of this movement issue because of the speed of delivery. That said, if you're delivering over multiple cycles, then you're still facing some of the same problems.
Yeah, that makes, in fact, I have to confess, I mean, in terms of ventricular ablation, I know that you talked about the potential for causing arrhythmias. And maybe I'm being cavalier, I'm less concerned about that. I mean, just based on preclinical studies, we don't seem to see that very often. I'm more concerned about the other point you raised, which is the motion issue, because one advantage of gating, right, would be that you're still firing at the same time of the cardiac cycle, and versus if you have arrhythmias induced, then your catheter is probably bouncing around everywhere, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that would be an interesting analysis to see if you deliver the same, let's say, quantum of energy, but one where gated, one not gated. Not so much, I mean, yes, you can look at arrhythmias, but more for me, does it affect lesion quality?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the funny thing too is that cells are a lot more sensitive to electroporation when there's high calcium concentrations. And so if you ablate during the vulnerable period where
Yeah.
you have high calcium concentrations cytosolically, then maybe you have you know you have an advantage, but you also have this pro-rhythmic issue. I agree that the pro-rhythmia thing is less of an issue, especially since you're talking about EP doctors who intentionally put people in arrhythmias all the time.
Yeah.
But the difference is if you're not gated, then reproducibility of the lesion may be somewhat of a challenge.
So can yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. The ventricle is probably the place where that you'll see more of that. The atria, of course, yeah, you're not that won't be as big of a factor.
So can I just ask you, this a bit of an aside? I know that I don't know much about this, but I know there's a lot of work in the tumor literature on combining electroporation with different, let's say, perturbations, whether it's chemical perturbations
Yeah,
or other perturbations.
yeah.
Um, just what you just said in terms of calcium loading, does that mean that if we pace faster, we'll likely get, well, I don't know, pace faster, but at least induce an arrhythmia? Should we get better lesions in AFib than in sinus rhythm? As an
Well,
example?
so yeah, so if Depends what stage of remodeling you're at, because
Yeah,
people who are in chronic, persistent, permanent AFib or whatever you want to call it, they tend to not have a lot of contractile function, and so you wonder. But yeah, I think
no,
theoretically,
sorry. What I meant specifically was to keep turnover. So in the
yeah.
same patient, versus if you do it in sinus rhythm versus there's an ongoing arrhythmia and presumably greater calcium
Yeah,
sort of
I predict
floating
there would be
around.
a difference, but whether there would be a difference that would be meaningful, I don't know. You would probably have to set up a very specialized experiment to measure
Yeah.
it. But for in the cancer literature, electrochemotherapy and using kind of adjuvant techniques in temperature is one of them. You can really lower the electroporation threshold by 1 degree, or 2 degrees difference can make a big difference in the melting temperature of the membrane itself. pH makes a difference, and there's a lot of data from the 1980s when people were trying to optimize pulse patterns and pulse
Mhm.
techniques for doing to increase yields of electroporation. But yeah, so right now, even people in Europe, there's an ongoing study where they give a bolus of calcium while they are doing electroporation, and it'll be a while before we see whether it makes a huge difference or just a little difference. But I think it's for calcium, it's well proven. But for chemotherapeutics like bleomycin, where
Yeah,
one molecule of bleomycin getting into the cell is
yeah.
enough to kill it, electroporation has a huge effect on the efficacy of that drug. So you can really lower the amount of how much drug you have to give in order to have an effective treatment.
Mhm.
Things like this could be used in the heart as well, if and
Yeah.
maybe down the
Well,
road. But
yeah, I mean, I don't know if we'll be using bleomycin, but what do you see as promising? I guess calcium is an interesting one, right? Just
yeah,
it would not be a big deal to give IV calcium.
yeah, just a little bit. Yeah, yeah.
Um, there's a one question. Actually, I don't know who this is. It just says iPhone. There's one question. What do you think about it says, do we have studies on the risk of microemboli to the brain? And so I wonder if you could talk about that, both from the perspective of what you think about the microemboli that are generated, as you showed very nicely on the high-speed camera. And second, what about particulates? What is the potential for particulates to cause problems?
Yeah, so
Yeah,
a lot of people are paying attention to the bubbles. I'm not really worried about bubbles because unlike injecting air into a person, which is mostly nitrogen, the diffusion coefficient of nitrogen is very high. Or sorry, very low, versus oxygen, which has a high diffusion coefficient, can be and hydrogen in particular, which has the world's highest diffusion coefficient. These micro bubbles will be absorbed or dissipated. They'll dissolve in blood very quickly and be expelled through the lungs very quickly, and pose less of a risk than an air embolism. So we can talk about that for a while. A lot of people are worried about it, but I think more and more data is showing that the amount of gas that's created and the impact from doing serial MRIs after ablation hasn't shown an increase in asymptomatic cerebral emboli with electroporation versus other technologies. Now, microemboli or particulate matter is a big concern to me, and hasn't gotten as much attention as it deserves. The issue is that when you have two things that can lead to the accumulation of proteinaceous material on electrodes that are well known, going back to pacing, and people understand this. The polarity of the electrode can accumulate negatively charged things like fibrin on the electrode, and repeated uses of that can lead to particulate matter that can fly away to the brain, the foot, the eyes, or wherever you want that you don't want it. And then, even though there's not a lot of heat overall, there are areas of hotspots in different catheter designs. So I think we're not out. I don't think I would say that we're out of the woods on that question. And I think that we'll have to be pretty vigilant, because we can't extrapolate the good or bad data from one technology to another as easily with pulse field as we can with some other technologies such as cryo or something.
One of our fellows, Yuri, just sent in a couple of questions. So one question that he asked, which is a really good one, that's very little talked about, which is preclinical studies have shown intimal fibrosis and tunica media fibrosis in coronary vessels after PF. And the question is, do you see any issues leading to significant vessel obstruction or plaque? I don't know about plaque, but certainly the significant vessel obstruction issue is an interesting one.
Yeah. Well, I think it's dangerous for us to assume that we don't harm the other tissue. I mean, what we've done by moving from heat to electric field mediated injury isn't that we've eliminated all our risk. It's just that we've moved in the right direction, that the risk profile is better. Now, if you're going to ablate right on top of the LAD with Q dot, and then look at the results, which could be quite dramatic very quickly, and irreversible, versus transient vasospasm and intimal hyperplasia, et cetera, that you would get from direct application of, let's say, a DC ablation. Because Whitcamp actually showed this in some vessels from a paper that was 8 years ago or something, where they did direct application onto the coronary arteries intentionally. And in one animal, they did see some evidence of that. And so depending on what waveform you're using, how much energy, how much joules, etc., I think that, yeah, you could get some long-term unfavorable narrowings of vessels. I know I have seen it in animal models as well.
And the second question Yuri asked, sort of related, is what do you see as other potential Achilles heels of PFA today, or maybe something we should be looking for in the future?
Well, there's the nuisance issues, which are tolerability.
Yeah.
Everyone's, efficacy is really great. Like, I think that, in 10 years, we're going to have a really good handle on the range. The other Achilles heel is that there are some areas of the heart that PFA may not be as well suited to treating. If it's important that we ablate ganglia and nerve fibers, it's not the best tool for doing that. Ganglia, it can be a good tool for, but nerve fibers themselves, it's a problem. Number two, the AV node. AV-NRT is something that, even if we know where the slow pathway is anatomically and with a high density electroanatomic mapping, our the cult of EP doctors has since 1989 or whatever relied on the production of junctional rhythm to identify that we're in the right spot while ablating. And the most sensitive cells in the entire body to electroporation, as far as we know, are probably the his Purkinje fibers. They may be twice as sensitive as other myocytes inside the heart. And so as you get closer, you may have some preferential ablation of the conduction system that would be unfavorable unless you like to put in pacemakers.
I think we're running out of time, but let me ask one last question. Emmanuel, one of our other fellows, is asking, you highlighted the importance of field strength. And his question is this materially different between single shot and focal delivery system with a smaller footprint? And how do you see this being harnessed in the future for ventricular ablation, where lesion depth is more critical? So maybe you could just talk a minute about, how to project lesion depth, I guess, with pulse field.
Multi electrodes and single point kind of platforms. They all rely on the same kind of volts over meter squared. It's just that the way the orientation of the electrodes can play a huge role in the far field attenuation of the signal. And I have a lot of material on that if you want to do a deep dive on another time. Big footprints mean big electric fields, and so I wouldn't necessarily say that you need to have a large multi-electrode array to get a big footprint. But you just need a big electric field. So you can either play with the volts or the meter squared, but that's how you reach deep into the tissue. The peak electric field strength is what limits how deep a lesion will be. And so what I think you're going to see is that pulse field generators are going to evolve towards higher peak voltages.
No, I mean, and just for everyone, the new company that Steve is working on is actually trying to come up with ways to, as he puts it, bend the electric field in a more favorable ways. And actually, this is what he's working on right here. You want to just show one image of this, Steve? I think it's cool. I know this is more, I suppose, commercial, but the idea. Yeah, go ahead.
So instead, what we're working on is ways of optimizing that reach of the electric field. So it's a great question. It's a question I've had, and as we've a lot of the technology you see being developed right now was really built to be a radio frequency delivery system that has been repurposed to be a pulse field system. And I've just taken the opportunity to say, hey, if we made something that's from the get-go built for pulse field, how do we optimize the electric field? And one of the ways we're doing that is by putting an electrode inside the fluid lumen. The electricity has to go around an obstacle to the outside electrode here. This attenuates the field incredibly, but at the same time, it concentrates the electric field around the catheter tip and allowing you to have either really deep reach or a very, very tolerable but very dense kind of electric field around the tip for atrial applications that potentially could be used in awake patients. And the difference is something like this. Like if you have one pig that has unipolar, same catheter, same place, versus field bending, just by playing with the electrode array, you can really change the depth of penetration, and you can change the tolerability of the field. And there are a lot of ways you can do this that people have been looking at, but I think that's part of the evolution that we're going to see over the next couple of years. The technology will probably kind of become more and more similar. But right now we're in this era where everyone is trying an enormous array of different approaches.
No, that's fantastic. So I think with that, I think we're going to go ahead and close. We're already running a few minutes over. Just for our fellows, Steve is actually here today doing some work with Jacob and Karuth in the experimental lab. So if you have time to go up there and take a look at some of their work, I'm sure you'll learn something interesting. So
I am around, but I think Jacob's working with another group today.
Oh, is he? Okay, well, you're around this week, I know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Please feel free to reach out to me. Anyone has any questions or wants to have a deeper dive in any aspect of this, I'm happy to talk about it. I talk about it all day long.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Steve. Talk to you soon. Okay, bye, everyone.